For 50 years, she mourned him as a hero, until a letter arrived that changed everything. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor Hayes's living room, the same way it had for the past 3 decades, casting delicate shadows across the worn Persian rug her mother had given her as a wedding gift in 1943. The pattern had faded over the years. The deep reds muted to dusty rose, the blues softened to grey, but Eleanor could still trace the intricate floral designs with her eyes closed, could still remember the day her mother had presented it to her with tears in her eyes, knowing even then that the war might take away the young man Eleanor was marrying. The grandfather clock in the corner, Robert's grandfather clock, she still thought of it, though Robert had been gone longer than he'd been alive, ticked its steady rhythm, marking time that had long ago lost its urgency. Each tick was a heartbeat in a house that had grown too quiet, too still, a metronome counting out the years of a life lived in the shadow of absence. Eleanor moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to fill her days with small rituals that kept loneliness at bay. Coffee first, always coffee, measured out with the precision of decades of repetition. 2 spoonfuls of sugar, no cream, the same chipped mug with the faded roses that had survived 30 years of use. She'd bought a set of 6 at a church sale in 1978, and this was the last one remaining, the others broken one by one over the years. Each loss a small grief she'd absorbed without comment. The newspaper spread across the kitchen table, reading glasses perched on her nose as she scanned headlines that mostly washed over her like distant waves. At 82, the world's urgencies felt removed from her quiet existence in this modest Cape Cod house in Portland, Maine, where she'd raised 3 children alone and watched them scatter across the country to build lives she only glimpsed through occasional visits and weekly phone calls that came with predictable regularity but increasing brevity. The house itself was a testament to a life lived in careful preservation. The wallpaper in the dining room was the same pattern she'd hung in 1956, yellow roses on a cream background, slightly peeling now at the seams but still serviceable. The kitchen linoleum, installed in 1972, was worn smooth in the paths she walked most often, from sink to stove to refrigerator, a triangle of daily routine that had shaped itself into the floor itself. Everything in the house was old but maintained, cared for, made to last, because Eleanor had learned early that nothing could be taken for granted, that everything could be lost in an instant. The walls of her home told the story she'd lived with for half a century, a museum of memory that she curated with the devotion of a priestess tending a sacred flame. In the hallway, a shadow box held Robert's Purple Heart and bronze star, polished monthly with a soft cloth that she kept specifically for that purpose, the metal gleaming as brightly now as it had when the medals arrived in the mail in 1945. Accompanied by a formal letter of commendation that praised his valor and sacrifice in language so formal it seemed to describe a stranger rather than the boy who used to make her laugh until she couldn't breathe. Above the mantel hung their wedding photograph, she in her mother's altered gown with its sweetheart neckline and long sleeves that she'd thought so elegant. He in his army uniform with the insignia of the 29th Infantry Division on his shoulder, both of them impossibly young, their faces bright with a future that would last only 14 months before the war swallowed it whole. She'd been a bride at 21, walking down the aisle of St. Mary's Church on a cold November day in 1942, her hands trembling as she held a bouquet of white roses that her father had somehow managed to find despite wartime shortages. She'd been a widow at 22, opening a telegram on a scorching July afternoon while her mother screamed and her father held her up because her legs wouldn't work anymore. Everything in between had been compressed into a span of time that now felt like a dream someone else had lived, like a story she'd heard rather than experienced. On the side table near her reading chair sat the framed portrait from his basic training. Private Robert James Hayes, 29th Infantry Division, his jaw set with determination, his eyes holding a seriousness that haunted her still. He'd been 23 when that photograph was taken, just a farm boy from rural Maine who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because it was the right thing to do, because every able-bodied man was going, because the country needed him, and Robert had never been one to shirk his duty. She could still remember the day he came home in that uniform for the first time. How strange he'd looked, how the military bearing sat awkwardly on shoulders more accustomed to lifting hay bales than saluting officers. She'd been 21. They'd had exactly 412 days together before he shipped out to England in preparation for D-Day. She'd counted them, marked each one in a diary she still kept in her bedroom drawer, a record of every moment they'd had before the war took him away forever. The living room was a shrine she'd built without meaning to, accumulated over decades of keeping him present in a world that had moved on without him. There was the folded American flag from his memorial service. They'd never recovered his body, lost somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy in July 1944, displayed in a triangular case with a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of Pit Robert J. Hayes, 1921-1944. Hotel." The memorial service had been held at St. Mary's, the same church where they'd married, and she'd sat in the front pew in her black dress, 5 months pregnant and numb with shock, while the priest spoke about sacrifice and honor and heaven, words that meant nothing to a girl who just wanted her husband back. Next to the flag sat the small wooden box containing every letter he'd sent home, organized chronologically, their edges soft from countless readings, his handwriting faded but still achingly familiar. She knew passages by heart, could recite them like scripture, like prayers she'd memorized through repetition and need. "My darling Eleanor, the food here is terrible, but the boys keep spirits up. We drill every day until we drop, but I don't mind, because every day of training is one day closer to getting this over with and coming home to you. Don't worry about me. I'll be home before you know it, and we'll have that family we dreamed about. I'll take you dancing at the Starlight Room like I promised. We'll have 6 kids, remember, and a house with a big yard and a dog. I can see it all so clearly. Love always, your Robert." They'd had that family, though not the way they'd planned. She'd been 3 months pregnant when the telegram arrived, a fact she hadn't yet shared with him, because she wanted to be absolutely sure, wanted to tell him in person when he came home, wanted to see his face light up with joy at the news. Instead, she'd given birth alone, with only her mother and a midwife present, and she'd held their son in her arms and named him Robert Jr., without his father there to see his face, to count his tiny fingers, to feel the weight of new life and possibility. She'd had 2 more children after that, Mary in 1947 and Catherine in 1949, conceived with no one, born into a family with a ghost father they learned about through stories and photographs and the careful preservation of memory. Eleanor had never remarried. People had tried, especially in those first years, well-meaning friends who insisted she was too young to spend her life alone, who brought around eligible widowers and bachelors, who arranged awkward dinners and social events designed to move her forward into a future without Robert. Her mother had worried constantly, fretting that Eleanor was throwing her life away, that she'd be alone forever, that the children needed a father figure. Even Robert's own brother William, home from the Pacific Theatre with a limp and nightmares, had suggested gently that Robert would have wanted her to find happiness again, that he wouldn't want her to stop living, that a life half-lived was no tribute to the dead. But how could she explain that she had found happiness once, and it had been so complete, so perfect, so exactly what she'd always dreamed of, that anything else felt like betrayal? How could she tell them that she still felt married, that she still wore her wedding ring, thin now from decades of wear, that she still set the table for 2 on their anniversary, November 14th, and ate alone while looking at his photograph? How could she make them understand that she talked to him still, told him about the children, asked his advice on difficult decisions, felt his presence in the house like a warmth she couldn't quite touch. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand. They hadn't loved Robert. So she'd poured herself into raising Robert Jr., Mary and Catherine instead, channeling all the love she'd saved for her husband into the children who carried his genes, his features, his legacy. She'd worked as a secretary at the lumber mill, typing letters and filing papers. Then as an office manager when the kids were older and she could take on more responsibility. She'd worked hard, saved carefully, made every dollar stretch because there was never quite enough, but somehow always just enough. She'd retired at 65 with a modest pension that was just enough when combined with Robert's widow's benefits. That monthly check that arrived like clockwork, a reminder that the government remembered even if the world had moved on. She'd volunteered at the VFW every Thursday for 30 years, serving coffee and organizing fundraisers and listening to old veterans tell their stories, needing to stay connected to that world that had taken Robert, needing to honor the sacrifice in whatever small way she could. She'd attended Memorial Day services every year, without fail, rain or shine, standing beside the monument in the town square while someone played taps and the veterans saluted and everyone remembered, however briefly, that freedom had a price. And she told her grandchildren stories about a grandfather they'd never meet, a hero who'd died fighting for freedom on the beaches of Normandy, who'd loved his country and his wife with equal devotion, who'd made the ultimate sacrifice so they could grow up in a world free from tyranny. It was the story she knew, the story she'd been told, the story she'd lived inside for 50 years, the narrative that had shaped every decision she'd made, every path she'd chosen, every moment of the life she'd built from the ruins of the one she'd lost. It was a story of love and loss, of sacrifice and honor, of a young man who'd done his duty and paid the ultimate price. It was a story she'd polished smooth over the decades, removing the rough edges of doubt and anger and confusion, creating something beautiful from something unbearable. The knock at the door came just after 9:30, as Eleanor was rinsing her coffee cup in the sink, the warm water running over her age-spotted hands, watching the soap bubbles swirl down the drain. She dried her hands on the dish towel, the one with the little bluebirds that Catherine had sent last Christmas from Seattle, where she lived with her husband and 2 teenage boys Eleanor saw maybe twice a year, and made her way to the front door, her hip complaining slightly with the arthritis that had been getting worse lately, making the stairs harder, making winter more of a challenge. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see a figure in uniform, and her heart seized for just a moment with that old terror, the one that never quite left women of her generation, the one that made them flinch at unexpected knocks, at official-looking envelopes, at any interruption that might bring the kind of news that shattered worlds. But no, of course not. Those telegrams didn't come anymore. That war was ancient history to everyone, but the ones who'd lived through it, the ones who still carried it in their bones, in their dreams, in the empty spaces beside them. She opened the door to find a young postal worker, couldn't have been more than 30, with red hair and freckles and the kind of easy smile that came from never having known real loss, from growing up in a world where war was something that happened on television, distant and unreal. He held a small package and a clipboard, and he looked confused, almost apologetic, as though he'd done something wrong but wasn't quite sure what. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. Yes? Her voice came out smaller than she intended, wavering with an uncertainty she didn't understand yet, some premonition her conscious mind hadn't caught up with. I have a delivery that requires a signature. It's been held up in our system. He glanced at his clipboard, frowning, his young face creased with puzzlement and something like embarrassment. Actually, I'm not quite sure how this happened, Ma'am. This should have been delivered decades ago, like way back. Our supervisor found it in a storage facility we're clearing out downtown. The old main post office building on Congress Street. They're converting it to apartments, and they found boxes and boxes of old mail that somehow never got delivered. Must have been misfiled or something, just sitting there all these years. This was in there. I'm really sorry about the delay." He laughed nervously, as though an 80-year delay was merely an inconvenience, a small mistake easily forgiven. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she took the clipboard, the pen feeling unnaturally heavy in her fingers, awkward. She signed her name in the shaky script that age had imposed on her once elegant handwriting, the signature barely recognizable as her own, looking more like her mother's handwriting now than the confident loops she'd written in her youth. The postal worker handed her a manila envelope, weathered and creased, with several official stamps across its face in faded red ink that had bled slightly, making the words barely legible. But it was the handwriting that made her breath catch in her throat, made her vision tunnel, made the morning suddenly feel cold despite the summer warmth. The address written in careful block letters, slightly faded, in a hand she didn't recognize, but which had the unmistakable formality of military correspondence, the kind of precise printing soldiers learned in basic training. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" the postal worker asked, his voice distant now, concerned, probably noticing the way the color had drained from her face. Yes, thank you." She barely heard her own voice, didn't recognize the flat, hollow sound of it, the way it seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. She closed the door carefully and stood in her entryway for a long moment, just stood there with the envelope in her hands, staring at it as though it might disappear if she looked away, as though it might be a hallucination brought on by age and too much time spent living in the past. The grandfather clock ticked. Somewhere outside, children laughed, high and carefree. The refrigerator hummed its familiar song. The world continued, as though nothing had changed, as though she wasn't holding something that felt like a bomb with a 50-year fuse, finally detonating. Her name and address were correct, though this had been her parents' house when she first moved here as a young widow in 1945, homeless and pregnant and shattered, unable to afford the apartment she and Robert had rented in town. The return address showed an APO number, Army Post Office, and a date that made her vision swim, made her grip the doorframe for support, made her wonder if she was having a stroke. September 1944. 80 years. This letter had been lost in some bureaucratic maze for 80 years, sitting in a box in a forgotten storage room while she'd lived an entire lifetime without it, raised children, buried her parents, watched grandchildren graduate and marry, grown old alone, all without knowing it existed, without knowing there was something more, something she'd never received. Eleanor's legs felt unsteady, weak. She moved to her reading chair, the one positioned to catch the afternoon light, the one where she read her evening mystery novels and worked her crossword puzzles, and sometimes just sat with her eyes closed, remembering. She sat down slowly, carefully, like someone who'd forgotten how to trust their own body, afraid she might fall, might break, like the fragile thing she'd become. The envelope was heavier than she expected, and she could feel something more than just paper inside. Irregular shapes, hard edges, the weight of objects that had traveled through time to reach her hands after all these years. The manila was brittle with age, yellowed and fragile as old skin, and she was almost afraid to open it, afraid it might disintegrate in her hands like some artifact from a tomb, like something that should have remained buried, like Pandora's box once opened, could never be closed again. But it was the postmark that held her frozen, that made her heart hammer against her ribs with a force that frightened her, made her wonder if this shock might kill her right here in her reading chair. September 15th, 1944. 2 months after Robert died. 2 months after the telegram, 2 months into her widowhood. She turned the envelope over with shaking hands that didn't feel like her own anymore, and that's when she saw it, a smaller notation, added later in different ink, in a different hand, official and impersonal and terrifying in its implications. Property of Paftet R.J. Hayes, 29th Infantry Division. Personal effects, to be delivered to next of kin. The room seemed to tilt, to shift on its axis, the familiar walls suddenly strange. Personal effects. They'd sent her a box in late 1944, delivered by a somber army chaplain who'd stood in her parents' living room with his hat in his hands and offered condolences that sounded rehearsed, mechanical, delivered 1,000 times to 1,000 broken families. The box had contained his wedding ring, the simple gold band they'd bought at Murphy's Jewelry, with money saved from his farm work, his dog tags bent and scratched from whatever had happened in those final moments, and a pocket watch that had stopped at 3:17. Time unknown whether morning or afternoon, the crystal cracked, but the watch itself still intact, still keeping that final moment frozen forever. They'd told her that was everything recovered from the battlefield, everything that remained of the man she'd loved. They'd told her he'd died instantly, that he hadn't suffered, that he'd been brave until the end, that he'd been buried in a temporary grave near St. Lo, that was later moved to the American cemetery at Normandy, one white cross among thousands in perfect rows that stretched on forever. What could possibly be in this envelope? What personal effects could have been separated from the others? Why would something be mailed 2 months after his death? Why would it have taken 80 years to reach her? Eleanor's hands shook as she carefully worked her finger under the sealed flap, the paper stiff and reluctant. The glue had weakened with age, brittle and yellow, and it opened with a soft tearing sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room, an intrusion into the silence she'd built her life around, a violation of the peace she'd carefully constructed. Inside, she found several items wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, the kind soldiers used to keep things dry in the field, still faintly smelling of the oil that had preserved it through decades, a scent that was both foreign and intimately military, taking her back to the smell of Robert's uniform when he came home on leave. She unfolded it carefully, her arthritic fingers clumsy with emotion and age and fear. First there was a photograph she'd never seen. Her breath stopped. Robert in his combat uniform, dirty and tired, his face smudged with what might have been mud or smoke or blood, standing next to another soldier she didn't recognize, a thin man with dark circles under his eyes. They both held cigarettes, smoke curling up between them, and wore expressions of weary endurance that she'd never seen on Robert's face in any of the photographs he'd sent home. In the carefully posed shots where everyone smiled despite everything, where the horror was edited out for the folks back home. This was different, this was real, this was war. She turned it over with trembling hands, and on the back, in Robert's handwriting, that familiar slant she'd memorized from love letters, she read words that made her world stop spinning. France, July 1944. Me and Danny after St. Lo. St. Lo. That was where they'd told her he died. In the brutal hedgerow fighting after the Normandy breakout, cut down by machine gun fire while advancing on an enemy position, killed instantly, they'd said, didn't suffer, they'd said. But this photo was dated after that. The photograph was from after he died. How could he have taken a photograph after he died? But the name written at the bottom of the letter, she had never heard it before. Eleanor's hands refused to stop shaking as she set the photograph down on the side table next to the formal portrait of Robert in his dress uniform. The contrast was devastating. The crisp, clean-cut soldier who'd left for war, and this exhausted, hollow-eyed man who'd survived something that had carved years into his young face. She picked up the small notebook again, that field journal that shouldn't exist, and opened it to the first page with fingers that felt numb, disconnected from her body. March 1944. Arrived in England, cold and wet. Everything's green, greener than Maine in spring. The boys are nervous, but trying not to show it. We all know what's coming, even if nobody says it out loud. Thinking of Eleanor tonight. Wonder if she got my last letter. Wonder if she knows how much I love her. Wonder if I'll make it back to tell her in person. Eleanor pressed the notebook to her chest and closed her eyes, feeling tears burn hot tracks down her weathered cheeks. She was 82 years old, and she was crying like the 22-year-old girl she'd been when the world ended the first time. But this was different. This wasn't the clean grief of knowing, of certainty, of a story with clear lines and defined endings. This was something else, a confusion, a betrayal, a fundamental questioning of everything she'd built her life upon. The envelope sat on her lap, still containing that letter, the letter Robert had written 4 days after he was supposed to be dead, the letter that began with words about lies. But she couldn't read it yet. Not yet. The photograph and the journal had already cracked something open inside her, and she needed to understand what she was protecting before she let it shatter completely. She needed to remember why the story she'd believed mattered so much, needed to touch the life she'd built on the foundation of his death before she allowed new truths to wash it away. Eleanor stood slowly, her hip protesting, and walked to the mantel where their wedding photograph hung. She'd been so young. They'd both been so impossibly young. The photograph had been taken by a professional her mother had insisted on hiring despite the expense, and Eleanor could still remember standing in that studio, Robert's arm around her waist, the photographer telling them to smile, to look at each other, to look like they were in love. They hadn't needed direction for that last part. The love had been so obvious, so radiantly present, that the photographer had simply captured what was already there. November 14th, 1942, St. Mary's Church. Her father had walked her down the aisle while the organist played Wagner, traditional and proper. Robert had waited at the altar in his uniform, and when she'd seen his face, the wonder in it, the disbelief that she was choosing him, the fierce joy, she'd nearly run the last few steps. The ceremony had been short, the reception shorter, because Robert only had a 3-day pass before he had to report back to base. They'd spent their wedding night in a hotel in Boston, nervous and tender with each other, and in the morning she'd watched him put his uniform back on and wanted to tear it off him, wanted to keep him civilian, wanted to stop time. But time hadn't stopped. It never did. She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street where children rode bicycles and neighbors mowed lawns, and life continued its peaceful, oblivious way. How many times had she stood at this window over the decades? How many times had she watched the world go by while living in the past, while keeping Robert alive in the only way she could, through memory, through story, through the careful preservation of what they'd had? The telegram had arrived on July 22nd, 1944. She'd been at her parents' house. She'd moved back in with them when Robert shipped out, unable to afford their apartment on her own. 5 months pregnant, though she hadn't told anyone yet, not even her mother. It had been a Saturday, she remembered, scorching hot, the kind of July day in Maine when the humidity made it hard to breathe. She'd been sitting on the porch, snapping green beans from the garden into a bowl, when she'd heard the knock. Her mother had answered the door. Eleanor heard the voices, official, apologetic, terrible, and she'd known. Before her mother screamed, before her father came running, before the Western Union man handed over the yellow telegram with its devastating brevity, she'd known. Some part of her had known the moment the knock came. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Private Robert J. Hayes, was killed in action in France on July 16, 1944. Killed in action. France, July 16, 1944. Those words had defined everything that came after. They'd been the boundary markers of her grief, the structure that contained her loss. Robert had died on July 16th, fighting for his country, making the ultimate sacrifice. That was the truth she'd been given, and she'd wrapped herself in it like armor against a world that suddenly made no sense. But now the notebook said July 18th. The photograph said July 1944, after St. Lo. And the letter, that letter still waiting to be read, said July 20th, and spoke of lies. Eleanor returned to her chair and picked up the notebook again, turning pages slowly, reading entries that chronicled a young man's journey into hell. March became April. April became May. The entries grew shorter, less detailed, as though Robert was running out of words for what he was seeing, what he was living through. May 15th, training exercises on the beaches. They won't tell us when, but we know it's soon. Saw some boys writing letters home. Can't think of what to say to Eleanor that won't scare her. Can't tell her the truth. Can't tell her how afraid I am. May 28th. Orders came. Can't write details, but this is it. This is what we came for. God help us all. Eleanor, if I don't make it back, know that you were the best thing in my life. Know that every moment with you was worth everything. Eleanor's throat tightened. She'd never received a letter like that. His letters home had been carefully cheerful, edited by military censors, and his own need to protect her from the reality of what he was facing. Reading these private thoughts, these words he'd written for himself, felt like eavesdropping on someone else's husband, someone she didn't quite know. June 6th, we landed. Can't write about it. Can't. Lost too many. Wallace, Jenkins, Morrison from Basic. Good men. Boys, really. All gone. We're moving inland. Everything's chaos. No time to think. Just survive the next hour, the next minute. D-Day. Robert had been there, had survived it, had lived through what historians now called the longest day. She'd known that, of course. The telegram had said he died in July, more than a month later. But reading his words from that day, from the immediate aftermath of the landing, made it real in a way it had never been before. He'd written this while covered in his friend's blood, while the war was actively trying to kill him. The entries became sparse after that. Sometimes days would pass with no entry at all. When he did write, it was brief, almost cryptic. June 15th, hedgerows worse than the beach. Can't see the enemy? They're everywhere and nowhere, lost 3 more yesterday. June 23rd, Danny saved my life today. Pulled me down half a second before machine gun fire. Would be dead if not for him. Owe him everything. Danny, the man in the photograph. Robert had never mentioned anyone named Danny in his letters home. But then, Robert had never mentioned most of what was really happening in his letters home. The letters she'd received had been full of comments about the weather, questions about her health, reminders to kiss his mother for him, promises that he'd be home soon. Nothing about the dying, the fear, the debt of life owed to a friend. Eleanor turned more pages, watching June become July, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. She knew what was coming, or thought she did. Somewhere in these pages was July 16th, the day he was supposed to have died, the day the telegram had marked as the end of Robert James Hayes. July 10th, St. Lo ahead. They say it's strategic, that we need it. Everything's strategic. Everything matters. Everyone's dying for things that matter. July 14th, heavy fighting. Can barely hold a pen. Danny's hit but alive. We got him to an aid station. Thought I'd lose him. Can't lose him. He's the only thing keeping me sane. July 16, Eleanor's hands froze. Here it was. The date. The day he died, according to the telegram, according to the official record, according to 50 years of certainty. July 16th, worst day yet. Ambush in the hedgerows. Lost half the platoon. Thought it was over. Thought I was dead. Should be dead. Don't know why I'm not. Got separated from the unit. Behind enemy lines now with Danny and 2 others, Harris and Coleman. No radio, no contact, just trying to stay alive and make it back to Allied lines. If I don't make it, someone tell Eleanor I love her. Tell her I tried to come home. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The room spun. Behind enemy lines, separated from his unit. On July 16th, the day he supposedly died, Robert had been lost, presumed killed, but actually alive and trapped in enemy territory. The telegram had been wrong, or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. The army had declared him killed in action because he'd disappeared, because in the chaos of combat, sometimes that was the only conclusion that made sense. But he'd been alive, lost, terrified, probably wounded, but alive. She turned the page with shaking hands. July 17th, moving at night, Germans everywhere. Harris took a bullet in the leg, slowing us down, but we won't leave him. Danny's wound reopened. We're all in bad shape. Found an abandoned farmhouse to hole up in during daylight. Couple of French civilians hiding in the cellar, old man and his daughter. They gave us bread and water, risked their lives for us. Don't even speak English, but they understand we're trying to get home. French civilians, a farmhouse, details that had never appeared in any official report, in any letter home, in any story Eleanor had been told. She thought of the countless times over the years when she'd tried to picture his last moments, tried to imagine exactly how it had happened. She'd always pictured the official version, machine gun fire, instant death, no suffering, clean, if anything about death could be called clean. But the truth was messier. The truth was 3 days of running, hiding, bleeding, hoping. The truth was kindness from strangers and the desperate bond of men trying to survive. July 18th, made it through another day. Heavy casualties. Lost Morrison and 3 others from second squad. Danny's holding up, but I can see it in his eyes. We all see it in each other. Don't know how much longer our luck will hold. Thinking of Eleanor tonight, of her smile, of the way she laughs at my terrible jokes. It keeps me going. If I make it home, I'm never leaving her again. Never. Eleanor pressed the notebook to her lips, tears flowing freely now, not bothering to wipe them away. He'd been thinking of her. In those terrible moments, lost behind enemy lines, wounded and afraid, he'd thought of her smile. She'd spent 50 years wondering if he'd thought of her at the end, and now she knew. She'd been there with him in his mind, giving him reason to keep fighting. The entry for July 19th was shorter, more urgent. July 19th. Coleman died during the night. Infection. We buried him in the woods, said what prayers we could remember. Harris can't walk anymore. Wounds bad. Probably infected too. Me and Danny made a stretcher from tree branches. We'll carry him. Officers are planning something. Found us this afternoon. Captain Morrison and 2 others said they have a mission. Need volunteers. It's dangerous. It's probably suicide. But it might save lives. It might save hundreds of lives. Danny and I said yes. We've come this far. Might as well go all the way. Eleanor's blood ran cold. A mission. Volunteers. Probably suicide. This wasn't in any official record. This wasn't part of the story she'd been told. What mission? What was so important that Robert would volunteer for something suicidal when he'd just been thinking about coming home to her, about never leaving her again? She turned to the final entry, dated July 20th, 4 days after he was supposed to be dead, the same date on the letter that waited in the envelope on her lap. July 20th. Writing this before we go. Don't know if I'll come back. The mission is, can't write details, but it's important, really important. If it works, it'll save the whole advance. If it doesn't, we'll be remembered as the guys who tried, I guess. Danny's with me. Whatever happens, we go together. I'm leaving this notebook with Captain Morrison. Told him to send it home if I don't make it. Told him to send the letter too. Eleanor needs to know the truth. She deserves the truth. I love you, Eleanor. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. You made my life worth living. You made all of this worth fighting for. If there's a heaven, I'll be waiting for you. If there's not, then at least I had you for a little while, and that's more than most men ever get. Take care of our baby. Yes, I know. I figured it out before I left. The way you were holding your stomach, the way you smiled differently. Tell our child about me. Tell them I tried to be brave. Tell them their father loved their mother more than anything in this world. Always yours, Robert. The notebook slipped from Eleanor's hands and fell to the floor. He'd known. He'd known she was pregnant. She'd been so careful, so worried about telling him and adding to his burdens, and he'd known all along. He'd gone to war, knowing he had a child coming, knowing he might never meet his son, and he'd gone anyway, because it was what needed to be done. Eleanor bent forward in her chair, racked with sobs that came from somewhere so deep she didn't know she still had access to such grief. For 50 years she'd carried the weight of never having told him, the guilt of thinking he'd died without knowing about Robert Jr. And all this time he'd known. He'd known, and he'd never said anything, because he was protecting her, giving her one less thing to worry about. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the room. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there, crying, reading, discovering that the man she'd loved was both exactly who she'd thought and someone she'd never fully known. The official story, killed in action July 16th, was a lie built on assumptions. The truth was so much more complicated, so much more painful, so much more heroic and heartbreaking. Robert hadn't died randomly in combat. He died volunteering for something dangerous, something important enough that he'd risked everything when he could have tried to make it back to safety, back to her, back to the baby he knew was waiting. Eleanor wiped her eyes and reached for the envelope again, for that letter that Robert had written in his final hours, the letter that promised truth and talked about lies. Her hands were steadier now, or maybe she just moved beyond steadiness, beyond control, into some realm where nothing mattered except knowing, except understanding what had really happened to the boy she'd loved. The letter was written on several sheets of paper, folded carefully, the creases worn soft as fabric. She unfolded it slowly, and Robert's handwriting filled her vision. That familiar slant, those carefully formed letters, the hand of a man who'd had limited education, but took pride in writing clearly, in being understood. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and she could hear his voice in the words, could almost feel his presence in the room with her. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and somehow this letter found its way to you. I'm writing this on July 20th, 1944, and I don't know if I'll make it through tomorrow. I need to tell you something that the army won't. I need you to know the truth about what happened here, about what I did, and about why everything you'll be told is a lie." Eleanor took a shaky breath and kept reading, finally ready to learn what her husband had died protecting, finally ready to understand what truth he'd thought was worth preserving. And what she read next would shatter 50 years of certainty. Eleanor's hands trembled as she smoothed out the yellowed pages on her lap, the paper so fragile she feared it might crumble under her touch. The afternoon sun had shifted lower, casting golden light through the lace curtains. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to read the words Robert had written in what he must have known might be his final hours on earth. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and somehow this letter found its way to you. I'm writing this on July 20th, 1944, and I don't know if I'll make it through tomorrow. I need to tell you something that the army won't. I need you to know the truth about what happened here, about what I did, and about why everything you'll be told is a lie. First, I want you to know that I love you. I've loved you since the moment I saw you at the church social in 1941, wearing that yellow dress with the white flowers. I've loved you through every moment of our marriage, through every letter I've written home, through every terrible thing I've seen here. That love has been my anchor. You need to know that before I tell you the rest." On July 16th, the date they'll probably tell you I died, our unit was ambushed in the hedgerows outside St. Lo. We walked right into it. German machine guns, mortars coming down like rain. Men were dying all around me. I got separated from the main unit with Danny, Private Daniel Sullivan from Boston, the best friend I've made over here, and 2 others, Harris and Coleman. We were trapped behind enemy lines. We should have died that day, but we didn't. We ran, we hid, we survived. For 3 days we moved through enemy territory, trying to make it back to Allied lines. Coleman died on the 2nd night from infection. Harris couldn't walk by the 3rd day. We were desperate, exhausted, and lost. That's when Captain William Morrison found us. He wasn't supposed to be there. His unit was miles away, but he was there for a reason, Eleanor. A mission, a secret mission that the army doesn't want anyone to know about. There's a German ammunition depot about 15 miles from St. Lo. It's massive, enough explosives to supply their entire defensive line for months. Intelligence found out about it through the French resistance, but the depot is too well defended for a normal assault. We'd lose hundreds of men trying to take it head on. The brass needed another way. Captain Morrison was putting together a small team, volunteers, to infiltrate the depot and destroy it from the inside. It's a suicide mission, Eleanor. Even the captain admitted that. The chances of getting in, planting the explosives and getting out alive are almost zero. But if it works, if we can destroy that depot, we'll save thousands of American lives. The entire advance depends on it. I volunteered. Danny volunteered. I know you're angry reading this. I know you're thinking I should have tried to make it back to you, back to our baby. Yes, I know about the baby. I figured it out before I left, saw it in your eyes. I wanted to tell you I knew, but I didn't want to burden you. I'm going on this mission because it's the right thing to do. Because if I don't, and those explosives keep feeding the German war machine, hundreds of other men with wives and babies waiting at home will die. I can't live with that. I can't come home knowing I had a chance to save lives and I didn't take it because I was afraid. But here's what I need you to understand, Eleanor. Here's the truth they won't tell you. If this mission fails, if we die doing this, the army will never acknowledge it. Captain Morrison was very clear about that. This operation is classified. It doesn't exist on any official record. If we succeed, maybe someday they'll tell the story. But if we fail, if we die, they'll report us as killed in action on our original dates of separation from our units. For me, that's July 16th. They'll tell you I died in the ambush, that it was quick, that I didn't suffer. It's a lie, Eleanor. A necessary lie, maybe, for national security or military secrets. But it's still a lie. And you deserve to know the truth. If I die tomorrow, I didn't die on July 16th in some random firefight. I died on July 21st, volunteering for a mission that might save thousands of lives. I died making a choice, doing something that mattered. I'm not writing this to justify what I'm doing. I'm writing this because you'll spend years wondering about my last moments, about whether I was afraid, about whether I thought of you. I can't spare you the grief, Eleanor, but I can spare you the uncertainty. So here's the truth. Yes, I'm afraid, I'm terrified, I don't want to die. I want to come home to you and hold you and meet our baby and live the life we planned. I want to grow old with you. I want 50 years of ordinary days. I want all of it. But I can't have it. Not if I turn away from this. I have to believe that my life, my death can mean something. There's something else you need to know. Danny saved my life on June 23rd. He pulled me down just as machine gun fire tore through the space where my head had been. I owe him my life, Eleanor. Every moment I've had since then, I owe to Danny. He's 21 years old. He has a girl back in Boston named Catherine. He was going to propose to her when he got home, showed me his grandmother's ring. He talks about her the way I talk about you. We're going on this mission together, and I need you to know something. If one of us makes it back and the other doesn't, I've made Danny promise to find you, to tell you the truth, and I've promised the same for him. If I survive and he doesn't, I'll find Catherine and tell her that her Danny died a hero. But I don't think either of us is coming back from this, Eleanor. This is the end. Tomorrow, July 21st, 1944, I'm going to die trying to destroy a German ammunition depot. I'm going to die with my best friend beside me, trying to do something good. I need you to live, Eleanor. I need you to raise our baby and be happy. Don't spend your life mourning me. Don't make me into some saint. I'm just a farm boy from Maine who loved you more than he knew how to say. I was scared. I wasn't always brave. But I tried. Tell our baby about me. Tell them the truth, not the lie the army will tell, but the real truth. Tell them their father chose to fight for something bigger than himself. I'm enclosing a photograph, me and Danny after we survived St. Lo. Look at his face, Eleanor. If I don't make it and he does, if Danny Sullivan knocks on your door someday after the war, let him in. Let him tell you the rest. And if Danny doesn't make it either, if this letter is all you have, then know this. My last thoughts were of you. My last prayer was for your happiness. Captain Morrison has promised to get this letter to you along with my notebook. He's a good man. He didn't want to lead us on this mission, but he's following orders. If you ever meet him after the war, don't blame him. He gave us a choice. We chose. There's a name I need you to remember, Marguerite Beaumont. She's the daughter of the French farmer who hid us for 2 days. She's 19, and she saved our lives. If you ever come to France after this war is over, try to find her. She lives in a farmhouse about 3 kilometers west of Saint-Lô. Her father's name is Claude. Tell her that Robert remembers her kindness. I don't know what else to say. How do you say goodbye to the person who made your life worth living? I love you, Eleanor Hayes. I loved you as a bride. I loved you as a wife. I'll love you as a memory when I'm gone. Take that love and live with it. Let it warm you. Let it be a gift instead of a burden. Be happy, that's all I want. Be happy, raise our child, and know that somewhere, somehow, I'm still loving you. Always and forever yours, Robert P. S. The mission is set for dawn, July 21st. If you ever find out what happened to the German ammunition depot, if you ever read about an explosion that changed the Normandy campaign, know that I was there. Know that it mattered. Eleanor finished reading and sat perfectly still, the letter resting on her lap, tears streaming down her face. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, someone called their children in for dinner. The world continued, indifferent to the fact that everything Eleanor Hayes had believed for 50 years had just been rewritten. He hadn't died on July 16th in a random ambush. He died on July 21st, she was certain now, volunteering for a classified mission. The army had covered it up, had given her a different date, a sanitized story, a lie wrapped in honor and flags and medals. She stood slowly, her legs shaky, and walked to the shadow box containing his medals. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, all of it awarded for actions on July 16th, 1944. But none of it mentioned July 21st. None of it mentioned the real sacrifice, the real choice, the real heroism. Eleanor's grief was transforming into something else, a burning anger that started in her chest and spread through her body. They'd lied to her. The government, the army, the officials who'd sent that telegram and those medals, they'd all lied. They'd taken Robert's real story and buried it under classification and secrecy. For 50 years she'd mourned the wrong death. For 50 years she'd told her children a story that was fiction. For 50 years she'd visited a grave and wept over a false date. But underneath the anger was something else. Robert had known. He'd known he was going to die, and he'd taken the time to write this letter, to preserve the truth. He'd thought about her in those final hours, had worried about her grief, had tried to give her answers. And he'd asked her to be happy. Eleanor returned to her chair and picked up the photograph again. Robert and Danny, exhausted and alive, smoking cigarettes after surviving Saint-Lô. She studied Danny's face. This Daniel Sullivan from Boston, who'd saved her husband's life, who'd gone with him on that final mission. Had Danny survived? Had he made it back to Boston? Had he married his Catherine? Eleanor's hands moved with sudden purpose. She reached for the telephone on the side table. Daniel Sullivan, Boston, would be in his early 80s now, if he'd survived. Catherine was his girl's name. Catherine Sullivan, if they'd married. It was enough. It might be enough. She dialed the operator, her fingers fumbling with the rotary dial. When the voice answered, Eleanor's words came out steady and clear. Yes, I need to place a long-distance call to Boston, Massachusetts. I'm looking for a Daniel Sullivan. Would be about 81 or 82 years old now. He served in the 29th Infantry Division during World War II. Yes, I'll wait. The line clicked and hummed. Eleanor sat with the receiver pressed to her ear, Robert's letter on her lap, and for the first time in 50 years felt something shift in her chest. Not the heavy weight of grief she'd carried like a stone, but something lighter. Questions. Possibilities. She needed to know whether the ammunition depot had exploded, whether the mission had succeeded, whether Robert's sacrifice had saved those thousands of lives he'd written about, whether any of it had been worth the lie. The operator came back on the line. "Ma'am, I have 3 Daniel Sullivans in the Boston area who might match that age. I can connect you to..." All of them, Eleanor interrupted. Connect me to all of them, one by one. I'll wait as long as it takes. Because after 50 years of living with a lie, Eleanor Hayes was done waiting for the truth to find her. She was going to hunt it down herself, follow every thread, ask every question, until she understood exactly what had happened to her husband on July 21st, 1944, and whether the man who'd saved his life had survived to tell the story the army never wanted told. The first Daniel Sullivan wasn't her Danny. His voice was rough with age and confusion, and when Eleanor explained why she was calling, he told her gently that he'd served in the Pacific, not Europe. He'd never been to France, never knew a Robert Hayes. He wished her luck finding the right man and hung up with the kind of polite dismissal that came from a lifetime of wrong numbers and mistaken identities. The second Daniel Sullivan had died 3 years ago. His widow answered the phone, her voice tired and wary, until Eleanor explained herself. Then the woman's tone softened with sympathy that felt like knives. My Dan was in the war, yes, but he came home in 1943. Lost his leg at Anzio. I'm sorry, dear. I hope you find who you're looking for. Eleanor thanked her and hung up, her heart sinking. 2 down, 1 to go. The operator connected the third call, and the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Eleanor was about to give up when someone answered, a woman's voice, younger than Eleanor's, maybe in her 50s or 60s. Hello? Yes, hello. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm trying to reach a Daniel Sullivan, who would be about 81 years old now. He served with the 29th Infantry Division in World War II in France. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Who did you say you were? Eleanor Hayes. My husband was Robert Hayes. He served with Robert Hayes. The woman's voice cracked. Oh my God, you're Robert's wife. You're Eleanor. Eleanor's heart stopped. You know who I am. My father talked about Robert his entire life. Wait, please wait. Don't hang up. Dad, come here, quickly. Eleanor heard fumbling, voices in the background, and then a man's voice, trembling with age and emotion. This is Daniel Sullivan. Who am I speaking with? This is Eleanor Hayes. Her voice broke. Robert's wife, Robert James Hayes, 29th Infantry Division. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Eleanor thought the connection had been lost. Then she heard something that sounded like a sob being held back, and when Danny spoke again, his voice was thick with tears. Eleanor, dear God, Eleanor, I've been looking for you for 80 years. The world tilted. Eleanor gripped the phone with both hands, pressing it against her ear, as though she could reach through the line and touch this man who'd known her husband in those final days, who'd been there when she couldn't be, who held answers to questions she'd been asking for half a century. You're alive, she whispered. You survived. Barely. Danny's laugh was bitter and broken. I survived, but Robert, your Robert. He's the reason. He's the only reason I'm here to take this call. Tell me. Eleanor's voice was steel now, sharp with need. Tell me everything. Tell me what really happened on July 21st, 1944. Another pause, and Eleanor heard Danny say something to his daughter, heard a door close. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more intimate, as though he was sharing a confession he'd held for too long. The mission was supposed to be impossible. Captain Morrison told us that from the start. There were 8 of us. Volunteers. All of us half dead already from the fighting, all of us with nothing left to lose except our lives. The German ammunition depot was 15 miles behind enemy lines, guarded by 2 full companies. Our job was to infiltrate it, plant explosives, and blow it sky high. Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing it in her mind, young men, exhausted and terrified, volunteering for death because it might mean something, might save others, might make the war end faster. We moved at night, Danny continued, his voice distant now, lost in memory. Robert and I stuck together. We'd made a pact. Whatever happened, we'd go together. If one of us died, the other would make it back and tell the truth. Tell my Catherine, we wouldn't let the army bury us under lies. The letter said the mission was on July 21st. Dawn, July 21st. We made it to the depot just before sunrise. The French resistance had given us intelligence, guard rotations, weak points in the fence, where to place the charges for maximum damage. It should have worked. It almost worked. Danny's voice caught, and Eleanor heard him take a shaky breath. We got inside, split into pairs. Each pair had a sector to wire with explosives. Robert and I took the main storage building. We were planting the charges when someone must have spotted us. Alarms went off, Germans everywhere. It turned into a firefight. Eleanor pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting back the sob that wanted to escape. She could see it. Robert running, firing, trying to complete the mission, while bullets tore through the air around him. Captain Morrison gave the order to detonate early. We hadn't finished wiring everything, but if we waited, we'd all die and accomplish nothing. He set the timer, 5 minutes. We ran for the perimeter fence. Robert was right beside me. We were almost there, almost safe. The pause that followed was so long and so heavy that Eleanor knew what was coming, could feel the weight of it pressing down through the phone line, through 80 years, through all the distance between the truth and the lie she'd been told. There was a German soldier, young kid, maybe 18. He had Robert in his sights. I saw it happening. I yelled, but Robert didn't hear me over the gunfire. The German pulled the trigger. Eleanor made a sound she didn't recognize, something animal and raw. I shot the German, Danny said, his voice hollow. But it was too late. Robert went down. I ran back for him. He was hit bad, chest wound, bleeding everywhere. I tried to lift him, tried to carry him, but he pushed me away. No, Eleanor whispered, but she knew. She knew what was coming. He told me to run, told me the explosives were going to blow any second and I had to get clear. I refused. I told him we'd made a pact. We'd go together. But Robert, Danny's voice broke completely now, dissolved into tears that had been waiting 80 years to fall. Robert said his part of the pact had changed. He said I had to live. I had to get back to you and Catherine and tell you the truth. He said that was more important than keeping him company while he died. Eleanor was crying now, openly, the tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her lap, onto Robert's letter that she still held. He gave me something, Danny continued. His wedding ring. He pulled it off his finger and pressed it into my hand. He said to give it to you, to tell you he loved you, to tell you about the baby. He knew, Eleanor. He knew about your son. He was so happy about it, talked about the baby all the time, made plans for names and what he'd teach the kid. In those last seconds, bleeding out on French soil, he was smiling because he was thinking about his child. They sent me a ring, Eleanor said through her tears. The army sent me his wedding ring and his effects. That wasn't his ring. Danny's voice was firm now, urgent. That was some other poor bastard's ring. Robert's ring was on my finger for 70 years. I only took it off when Catherine died last year. She made me promise I'd wear it until she was gone, as a reminder of the friend who'd saved my life, who'd given me a future. I have it here. It's yours. It was always supposed to be yours. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Everything was too much. Too much truth, too much pain, too much of the past reaching forward to overturn the present. The ring she'd kept in the shadow box, the ring she'd touched on her darkest days when she needed to feel close to Robert, wasn't even his. It was a stranger's ring, one of thousands distributed by the army to grieving widows who'd never know the difference. What happened then? She managed to ask. After he gave you the ring. I ran. God help me, I ran. The explosives detonated 30 seconds later. The entire depot went up. The biggest explosion I'd ever seen. It lit up the dawn like a second sun. The shockwave knocked me flat from 200 yards away. When I looked back, the whole complex was just gone. Burning rubble, nothing left. Danny's breathing was ragged now, and Eleanor could hear the toll this story was taking on him, the weight of survivor's guilt that he'd carried for 8 decades. Robert saved my life twice. Once when he pushed me away from that firefight, and once when he made me run. If I'd stayed, I'd have died in that explosion. We both would have. And then no one would have known the truth. No one would have been able to tell you what really happened. Did the mission succeed? Eleanor asked, needing to know if Robert's death had meant what he'd hoped it would mean. Did it save lives? The depot was completely destroyed. Every round of ammunition, every artillery shell, every mortar gone. The German defensive line collapsed 3 days later. The historians say it shaved weeks off the campaign, saved thousands of casualties. Your Robert, our Robert, he died for something real. It mattered. It changed the war. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place that had been locked tight for 50 years. Robert had died the way he'd chosen, making a difference, saving lives, giving everything for something bigger than himself. The lie about July 16th had robbed him of that meaning, had turned his death into random chance instead of purposeful sacrifice. "Why didn't you find me?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "You said you've been looking for 80 years. Why did it take a phone call from me?" Danny's sigh was heavy with regret. "I tried. God, I tried. I made it back to Allied lines, spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, and the first thing I did when I could walk was ask about you. But the mission was classified. Captain Morrison had died in the explosion. The other survivors were scattered. When I told my commanding officer that I needed to deliver a message to Robert Hayes' widow, I was told in no uncertain terms that I would not discuss the mission with anyone, ever, under penalty of court-martial. They threatened you. They did more than threaten. They told me that Robert Hayes had been killed on July 16th in a classified action, and that the official record would show he died in an ambush. They told me that if I contradicted that story, I'd be charged with treason for revealing classified operations. I was 21 years old, Eleanor. I'd just watched my best friend die. I was terrified. Eleanor heard the anguish in his voice, the decades of guilt and frustration. I came home to Boston, married Catherine like I'd planned, and tried to live with it. But I never stopped looking. After the war ended, after things were declassified, I tried to find you. I wrote to the army. I hired a private investigator in the 60s. But Hayes is a common name, and I didn't know where you'd ended up. Your parents had moved. The trail was cold. I was here, Eleanor said softly. I've been here in Portland the whole time, in the house where the telegram arrived. I never thought to look in Maine. Robert always talked about you like you were from his hometown, but I thought—" Danny stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought. I should have tried harder. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all. 50 years of separation from the truth. 80 years of Danny carrying Robert's ring and his guilt. A lifetime of stories told wrong and memories built on false foundations. You were a boy. They put you in an impossible position. "I'm 81 now," Danny said. "I don't have much time left. But before I go, I need to give you what's yours. The ring. The real one. And I need to tell you everything. All the stories Robert told me about you. All the things he wanted you to know. He talked about you every day, Eleanor. Every single day. You were his light in that darkness." I want to meet you," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I want to hear those stories. I want Robert's ring. And I want—" She paused, looking down at the letter in her lap, at the name written there in fading ink. "I want to go to France. I want to find Marguerite Beaumont. I want to see where it happened." Danny was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice held something Eleanor hadn't heard in it before: hope. "I'll go with you, if you'll have me. I've been back twice, but I could never find the farm where they hid us. Maybe together we can." Eleanor felt tears flowing again, but they were different now. Not just grief, but something else. Purpose. The need to honor Robert properly, to tell his true story, to give his sacrifice the recognition it deserved, even if that recognition came 80 years too late. "My daughter Jennifer is here," Danny said. "She'll help us arrange everything. We'll fly you to Boston first, and then we'll go to France together. We'll find the truth, all of it. We'll make sure Robert's story is told right." Eleanor looked around her living room, at the shadow box with the fake ring, at the photographs and letters and carefully preserved memories, at the life she'd built on a foundation of lies, however well-intentioned those lies might have been. It was time to rebuild on truth. "When can you come?" Eleanor asked. "I'll be on a plane tomorrow if you'll see me." "Come," Eleanor said. "Come and tell me about my husband. Tell me everything the army never wanted me to know." After they said goodbye, and Eleanor hung up, she sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. The shadows grew long, and the familiar space transformed into something strange and new. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. Robert hadn't died on July 16th. He died on July 21st, choosing sacrifice, saving lives, pushing his best friend toward a future he'd never have. The man she'd mourned was both more and less than the man she'd thought she knew. More heroic, more purposeful, more heartbreaking in his final choices, but also more human, more afraid, more honest about his fear and his love and his desperate wish to come home. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where the last light of day was fading into dusk. Somewhere out there, Daniel Sullivan was making plans to fly to Maine, carrying a wedding ring that had traveled through 8 decades and a lifetime of guilt. Somewhere in France, perhaps, Marguerite Beaumont was an old woman now, maybe with grandchildren of her own, maybe still remembering the American soldiers she'd hidden in her father's cellar. And somewhere in the earth of Normandy, in a grave marked with the wrong date, Robert James Hayes was waiting for his story to be told true. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and made a silent promise to the boy she'd married, to the man she'd loved, to the hero she'd never fully known until today. She would find the truth. All of it. She would give him the honor he deserved. And she would finally, after 50 years, allow herself to grieve the real death instead of the sanitized fiction. The weight of what had been hidden was crushing, but beneath that weight, Eleanor felt something else stirring, something she hadn't felt in half a century, the possibility of peace. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood at the arrival gate of Portland International Jetport, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Robert Jr. stood beside her, his arm hovering protectively near her elbow. At 61, her son had his father's jawline, his father's serious eyes, and right now those eyes were filled with concern. "Mum, you don't have to do this," he said for perhaps the 10th time. This man could be anyone. Eleanor turned to look at her son, this man who'd never known his father except through stories she'd told, stories built on the wrong foundation. "Your father saved his life. He saved mine too, by keeping his promise. I need to meet him." Passengers began emerging from the jetway, and then she saw him, an elderly man moving slowly with a cane, his daughter supporting his other arm. Even across the distance, even after 80 years, Eleanor recognized something in his face. His eyes, when they found hers, held the weight of decades of carrying someone else's death. Danny Sullivan stopped walking and stared at Eleanor with an expression that combined wonder, grief, and relief. Then, slowly, he released his daughter's arm and walked toward Eleanor on his own, each step deliberate despite the tremor in his hands. They met in the middle of the terminal, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Eleanor saw tears tracking down Danny's weathered face. "You look like him," Danny said finally, his voice hoarse. "Robert always said you had the kindest eyes he'd ever seen. He was right." Eleanor couldn't speak. She reached out with shaking hands, and Danny understood. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and placed it in her palm. "His ring," Danny said. "The real one. I'm sorry it took 80 years." Eleanor opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple gold band, tarnished with age. She lifted it out and looked inside, and there, engraved in tiny letters, were the words she'd chosen in 1942, E.H. to R.H., always. Eleanor held Robert's actual wedding ring, the one he'd worn, the one he'd pulled off in his final moments to send home to her, and she felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for 50 years begin to thaw. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping your promise." They spent 3 days together in Maine. Danny came to Eleanor's house each morning and stayed until evening, and they talked. They talked the way only people who'd loved the same person could talk, sharing memories and filling in gaps and constructing together a more complete picture of Robert James Hayes than either had possessed alone. Danny told her about the weeks before D-Day, about how Robert had held her photograph in the landing craft and kissed it before they hit the shore. He told her about the terrible days in the hedgerows, about how Robert had written letters home every chance he got, even when his hands were shaking too badly to write clearly. Eleanor showed Danny the notebook, and together they read through Robert's entries. When they reached the entry about Danny saving Robert's life on June 23rd, Danny closed his eyes and gripped his cane hard. "I dream about that moment sometimes," Danny said quietly. "I dream that I was too slow, that I didn't pull him down in time. Survivor's guilt. I've lived with it my whole life." "He lived an extra month because of you," Eleanor said firmly. "That month matters. You gave us that." "Dus." On the second day, Danny gave Eleanor a manila folder containing declassified mission reports, newspaper articles about a massive explosion in July 1944, historical analyses that credited the destruction of that depot with saving countless lives. "I wanted you to know it mattered," Danny said. "Robert's death wasn't for nothing. The mission succeeded. Lives were saved. He died a hero, Eleanor, a real hero." Eleanor read through the documents late into the night, and she felt layers of grief and anger begin to settle into something more manageable. Understanding. Acceptance. Robert had made a choice, and that choice had consequences that rippled through history. He died on purpose, not by accident. 1 month later, Eleanor stood in the American cemetery at Normandy, with Danny beside her, both leaning on canes, both crying openly. The white crosses stretched in perfect rows, and somewhere among them was Robert's grave, with the wrong date carved into marble. A guide led them through the rows until they found it. Robert James Hayes, Private, 29th Infantry Division, July 16, 1944. Eleanor knelt with difficulty and placed her hand on the cool marble. "I know the truth now," she whispered. "I know what you did. I know why. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." Danny knelt beside her and placed his own hand on the grave. "I kept my promise, brother. I found her. I told her everything. You can rest now." The next day, they drove west from the cemetery, following Danny's fragmented memories and a map. They were looking for a farmhouse 3 kilometers west of St. Lo, where 2 American soldiers had hidden in the summer of 1944. They found it by chance. Jennifer spotted an old stone farmhouse, and when they knocked, an elderly woman answered. She was in her late 90s, her face mapped with wrinkles. But when Danny spoke in broken French, when he said the names Robert Hayes and Claude Beaumont, her expression transformed. "Mon Dieu," she whispered, "les soldats américains, you came back." Marguerite Beaumont invited them inside with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. She made them tea, and then she told them her story. She remembered the 2 American soldiers who'd hidden in her father's cellar for 2 days. She remembered bringing them bread and water, risking execution if discovered. She remembered the way one of them, Robert, had shown her a photograph of his wife and tried to explain in gestures how much he loved her. "He drew a heart," Marguerite said, sketching the shape in the air. "And he pointed to the picture and then to his chest." I understood. L'amour. Love. Eleanor wept hearing this, learning about Robert's final days from someone who'd been there. Marguerite brought out a small wooden box she'd kept for 8 decades. Inside was a slip of paper with Robert's handwriting. "Thank you, Robert." "I kept it all these years," Marguerite said. "I hoped one day someone would come. I hoped I could tell them their soldier was kind, that he was good, that helping him was the proudest thing I did in the war." When they finally left, Marguerite embraced Eleanor with surprising strength. "Your husband was a hero," she said in careful English. He saved us. He saved France. Merci. Remember him with pride. Eleanor held Marguerite and thought about the threads of connection that war created. Robert had touched this woman's life for 2 days, and she'd remembered him for 80 years. That meant something. On the flight back to America, Eleanor turned Robert's ring on her thumb and felt peace settling over her like a blanket. She understood now. She understood why Robert had volunteered for that mission, why he'd pushed Danny away in those final moments, why he'd asked her to be happy instead of frozen in grief. 2 months after returning from France, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a writer from the Veterans History Project. Eleanor had reached out to them, determined to put Robert's real story into the official record, to correct the lie that had stood for 80 years. She told the whole story, the letter, the notebook, Danny Sullivan, Marguerite Beaumont, the classified mission, the truth about July 21st. She showed the evidence and made sure that Robert's name would be associated with the real story of his death. There are probably others like him, Eleanor told the interviewer. Other men who died on classified missions whose families were given false stories. This can't just be Robert's story. It has to be bigger than that. That evening, Eleanor gathered her children and grandchildren in her living room, all of them flown in or driven up for this moment she'd insisted was important. They filled the small house to bursting, 3 generations of Hayes family. She told them everything. She showed them the letter, the notebook, the photographs. She told them about Danny and Marguerite and the ammunition depot and the truth about July 21st, 1944. Your grandfather didn't die by accident, Eleanor said, her voice steady. He chose. He chose to volunteer for a dangerous mission because he believed it would save lives. He chose to push his friend to safety instead of saving himself. He chose purpose over survival. And then the government chose to bury that choice under a lie. She paused, looking at each of them. I'm not angry anymore. I was, at first, but Robert asked me in his letter to be happy, to live, to not freeze myself in grief. It took me 80 years, but I'm finally doing what he asked. Robert Jr. spoke up, his voice rough. What do you want us to do with this, Mom? With the truth? Eleanor smiled. I want you to remember it. I want you to tell your children, and I want them to tell theirs. I want Robert's real story to be part of our family history. I want every generation of Hayes descendants to know that they come from a man who chose courage, who loved deeply, who made hard decisions. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Robert's ring. I'm giving this to you, Robert. You were named for him. You carry his name and his face. Now you carry his truth too. Keep it safe. Pass it down. Make sure he's not forgotten. Robert Jr. took the ring with shaking hands, holding it up to the light, reading the inscription. Always, he read aloud. Always, Eleanor repeated. That's what love is. It doesn't end with death. It doesn't fade with time. Your grandfather loved me from across an ocean, from across a war, from across the grave, and that love shaped everything that came after. That's his real legacy, not the medals or the false date on his grave marker, but the love that refused to die. The family stayed late into the evening, talking and crying and laughing as Eleanor shared stories she'd never told before. They looked at the photographs, both the official ones and the new one of Robert and Danny, exhausted and alive. When they finally left, Eleanor stood at her window watching their cars disappear down the street. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy silence of grief and secrets, but the peaceful quiet of a story finally told, complete. She walked to the mantel and looked at Robert's photograph, that young soldier frozen in time at 23. She touched the glass gently. I kept your promise, she said softly. I lived, I raised our son, I found happiness where I could, and now I've told your truth, the whole truth. You can rest now, my love. We both can. Eleanor returned to her reading chair and picked up the letter one more time, reading the final words Robert had written. Be happy. That's all I want. Be happy, raise our child, and know that somewhere, somehow, I'm still loving you." She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, back with the photograph and the notebook, all of it together. The complete story of Robert James Hayes preserved for future generations who would need to know that love endures, that truth matters, that some sacrifices echo through time. Outside, the evening light faded to dusk. Inside, Eleanor sat in her quiet house and felt for the first time in 50 years completely at peace. The weight of unanswered questions had been lifted. The burden of incomplete grief had been set down. Robert's story had been told true, and in that truth, Eleanor had found not just closure but something more precious. The ability to remember her husband not as a sanitized hero from a telegram, but as a real man who'd loved her, feared death, chosen courage anyway, and thought of her in his final moments. That was enough. That was everything. If this story touched your heart, think of the letters never sent and the truths never told in your own family. Think of the veterans whose real stories remain buried under classification and convenient lies. Think of the widows who mourned incomplete truths and the children who grew up not knowing what their parents really sacrificed. Leave a comment sharing a memory of someone whose story deserves to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to know that truth, however painful, is worth pursuing. And subscribe for more stories that honor those who loved and lost during the war that changed the world. Because every untold story matters, every hidden truth deserves light, and every sacrifice, no matter how long buried, deserves to be remembered.